G'day. Today's little project, well, it's not really a project, it's a bit of a review of a Yamaha HTR-6230 natural sound AV receiver. Now, the only reason that I'm doing this, I bought this one to replace an ancient garage stereo, thinking that this would be a simple stereo to use with, I've got 4 speakers set up in my shed slash garage slash man cave, and I thought this would be a perfect solution. Anyway, is it? So in 2023, would you go and spend money on an amplifier like this? This one's about 10 years old, and it's got some pluses and it's got some minuses. The pluses are that this one came with the factory remote, which is great. It's the RAV284. You can just see some clip marks on the side where I've used a spudging tool to pull this one apart. It was in pretty poor condition when it came to me. I've cleaned it up and recarboned all the contacts. Works beautifully now. And basically this amplifier, what is it? It's 5.1 DSP surround sound. It's got 100 watts per channel, 1080p only. There's no 4K support. There's also no upscaling. So if you've got an older signal, 720p, which is highly unlikely, or VHS, again, possibly unlikely, then it's not going to upscale to 1080p. It does have, through this little port here, the optimizer mic, something called YPAO, which is Yamaha Parametric Acoustic Optimizer. That's actually quite a handy little thing. You plug your mic in, and I'll show you that in a little while, and it basically optimizes the acoustics of the entire room with your speakers by sending little pulses out and measuring them, and measures distance, measures frequency response, etc., etc. Now, critically, there is no, and I've got a large sort of test TV setup here, there is no on-screen display. So anything that you do is not mimicked on a television, like more advanced receivers. Even my ancient Denon AVR-2805, which would now be 20 years old, in fact it is 20 years old, has a pretty decent on-screen display. So the other critical thing about this is, in terms of not having an on-screen display on a television and having to do everything with this hokey little on-screen electrofluorescent on-amp display, is that the other big Achilles heel is that there is no audio support for HDMI. So what that means is it does pass the signal through from HDMI into whatever the end device is. So for example, if you've got a Blu-ray player and you've plugged your Blu-ray player into the HDMI of the amplifier, and then from the amplifier into a television, the television will still output the sound, so the audio channel is getting to the television, but the amplifier does not pick that up and it will not re-amplify it, and of course it doesn't decode it because it's not re-amplifying it. So that means that you've got to use SPDIF or Toslink, digital optical, to take that signal, assign it to an input here, and then you've got to use the SPDIF as the optical decoding. So that is really, really primitive. So would I buy this amplifier? Absolutely not. It's got A and B speakers. It's got 40 channels of tuning. Spin that around so you can see. So we've got one, two HDMI inputs. That's the HDMI out. There are your 2 Toslink SPDIFs. You've got 1 coaxial, 2 big speaker binding posts for your main A speakers, but the rest of the speakers are these tragic little spring clips, and you try getting a big fat copper wire in there, you're going to really struggle. So there's the model number, HTR-6230. AM, FM, you got a couple of RCA inputs, you got a couple of component outputs and inputs, and there's some composite video going in there. So, and also a dedicated subwoofer out, and you've got 9 selectable crossover frequencies for the subwoofer. The reality is you don't need that because you mostly do your subwoofer crossover frequency management on the subwoofer itself if it's a decent one. You go, cycle through your inputs, DVD, CD, tuner, compact disc, multi-channel input, DVR, and video auxiliary cable. Now you can assign each of these 4 main buttons here. It's like a macro, so the intent is that you have scene 1 might be dedicated to compact disc, and that just might be if you only listen to classical, maybe you have a classical decoding mode, or if it's say scene 2 could be movies, and you might have that set to Dolby Pro Logic 2 or something like that. You've got tone controls, bass, treble, plus or minus 10 dB. I've got those cranked up to 10. You can't really tell much of a difference with those. The night mode here is quite cool. What that does is that's like a compression expansion function. So it means that it changes the dynamic range at low listening volumes so that you don't have to have the volume cranked all the way up, so that at night you don't tick off your neighbors with very, very quiet passages that you normally can't hear. And then when it gets to a very loud passage in a movie, then it reduces the dynamic range between the quiet and the loud, which is quite a handy feature. So the other thing is the display on this one is getting kind of dim. So I'm going to see if I can go into the menu system, have a poke around and see if we can adjust the display. And I'll show you, I'll give you an example of what it's like to play with this using the touch buttons or using the factory remote control to adjust settings. So if you want to change the dimmer, you go into menu, go into manual setup, sound menu, input menu, option menu, press enter, display set, press enter, and then you've got left and right. It's reasonably, you've got 4 levels of dimming there, but you can see there that the dimmer is actually, or the display is starting to decay, and it's not a function of the brightness, which is already at 100%. So you press return to get out of that, return to get out of that, return to get out of that, and press menu again to get out of that. But the fact that you've got to navigate this bewildering array of button presses on this very, very small electrofluorescent display is really lazy on Yamaha's behalf. The fact that there's no on-screen display to a television or a monitor is really, really poor form. It's lazy, and it means that I just could not recommend buying this or using this amplifier because it's too complicated for mum and dad music listener, and it's not good enough for an audiophile or someone that really wants to get involved and invested in their music. The sound is great. I really can't say enough about that. It really sounds good. Plenty of power. 100 watts a channel is enough. I mean, you can adjust individual sound fields. You can assign things to menus and scenes. As I said, you can manage sound volume levels between different sources so that you could adjust CD to Blu-ray to tuner, and you can adjust individual sound volume settings for each particular one. You've got a parametric equalization setting. There are so many different, I guess, options that you've got, but basically it's just too complicated. All right, I've taken the screws out, so let's see what's inside this bad boy. So what do we got? Got a nice big heatsink here, got no cooling fans, fairly basic stuff. A couple of big filter capacitors there. And you can see this unit is actually quite rusty, so I'd say probably lived a fair bit of its life close to the coast. Pretty basic internals, so I'll reassemble it. I've hooked up some speakers just for testing, and I'll have a bit of a play and show you some of the sound fields and show you some of the features. Okay, with sound fields here, and I've just got some old Wharfdale dipoles set up as my fronts and some test speakers for the rears. So we can go into straight. And switch out of that into your other programs. The reality is, just turn that down so I can actually hear myself think, that you don't, I find I don't use any of these types of surround sound fields. I almost always use either stereo or 5-channel just to spread the sound a bit more evenly, or if I'm watching a movie then I'll use Pro Logic or Dolby Digital or whatever it comes out as. Now you've also got tone fields here, bass, treble, I've got those set to +10. You really don't get much of an impact with the tone controls, but they're there. And it sounds a little bit lifted with a 10 dB boost at 100 Hertz and a 10 dB boost at 10 kilohertz. Standard bass and treble. A and B speakers, you can see A speakers there. You can select B, they're relay switched or off. I guess if you wanted to have headphones. Righto, so what I've done is I've set up a DVD player that has, I'll just show you, it's got HDMI out. So I've got HDMI coming from the back of the DVD player, going into the back of the amplifier as the DVD source, and that is going, follow that up to my television. There you go. So that is displaying, and if I press play, good old Australian classic. Good on you, David Helfgott, what a champion. So what you'll hear is there is sound coming through the TV. So the sound does come through. You get pass-through sound through the HDMI to the final display, but if I now try and turn the volume up on the amplifier, basically you'll see that nothing is coming up and the right source is selected. So if we go to input, go to DVD, and there's no audio coming through. Got plenty of volume there. So this is what I mean by there being no HDMI audio processed by this amplifier. So you get pass-through, so the audio is in the signal, that's obvious because it's coming through to the television, but it's not being processed by the amplifier, which means you would need a separate Toslink or SPDIF digital optical out to carry the audio, which is a real pain in the butt. So you need a separate optical as well as an HDMI if you want to get any kind of audio through this amplifier. Now the other thing that I've noticed is that there is absolutely no on-screen display with this amplifier. So if I press volume, you get volume changes on the amplifier, but you don't get anything at all coming up on the television as a display. So there's no menu. All of the menu controls, if I press menu here, all the menu controls to adjust sound fields and details in the amplifier are controlled via the remote and via the on-screen buttons here, and you do need the manual and you do need the remote. Okay, next thing I want to show you is the automatic microphone setup, what Yamaha calls YPAO. So if you plug any microphone in, it doesn't have to be a Yamaha one, it'll say setup auto, go to your remote control, make sure you're in amp mode, and press start or enter, which is the auto mode. So it finishes, it goes through all of the speaker distances and all of the equalizations. So plus 1 dB for the center right. So you can set that, you can cancel it, you can redo it, you can do whatever you like. So if I go over to cancel, no, actually I'll set that. Even though my son's playing a video game upstairs and it's very loud. This is just to basically prove the concept. So the auto setup is done. And if you unplug the mic, don't pay the ferryman. Wow, songs of my youth. So if we go back to tune-up, we're back where we started, and it tells you YPAO that the auto setup has been done. Overall, I'd say this amp is what I would consider to be very basic. It does use 192 kilohertz 24-bit digital audio conversion, or DAC, for all channels. That's great. Provides accurate sound field reproduction for all high-quality multi-channel sources. Which is really, really, really good. Now, specifications. It's got FM, it's got AM. It's got 40 presets in total. Power output's pretty good, 100 watts into 8 ohms, but that's at 0.06%. So that's pretty good total harmonic distortion. 100 watts is plenty. The reality is that most amps never go above 10 watts in real output. It does not have phono, as I've mentioned. It's got 2 digital connections, and basically it's an 8 kilo amplifier, which means the most of the weight in an amp is in the transformer, so that's a pretty small transformer. As you've noticed, it does have straight transfer, as in straight pass-through, so it bypasses all the tone controls. It's got 11 selectable sound fields, 3 in music, 2 in entertainment mode, 2 in movie mode, 2 in stereo mode, and 2 in enhancer mode. You get 4 selectable sound Dolby modes: Pro Logic, Pro Logic 2 Movie, Pro Logic 2 Music, Pro Logic 2 Game. There are several sub-parameters like panorama for wraparound and dimension to bias front or back within the Pro Logic modes, but really that's all a little bit of advertising gimmick. As I said, plus or minus 10 dB for bass and treble. Really handy. You've got A and B selectable speakers, which is really good. You've got an adjustable subwoofer out with 9 programs or 9 crossover frequencies selectable on the subwoofer. I've been through the issues with Toslink or SPDIF and HDMI on this amplifier, which is its real Achilles heel. You can go into the program mode through the menu, and you can select an initial volume setting and a maximum volume setting. And you can also select a mute level of either 0 dB. Basically, if I press mute now, that is at 0 dB, and you've also got a minus 20 dB option for mute, which is actually quite good. Good for, it still plays a bit of background, but it drops it by 20 decibels. You can rename input, so you could rename, say, DVD to My DVD or Dad's DVD or whatever will fit within the display characters along the front. All in all, the biggest Achilles heel for this thing is the fact that there's no optical out for HDMI, and the fact that it doesn't handle 4K, there's no phono, there is no on-screen display. It's also quite painful, so if I want to swap between either sound field modes and tuner presets, see, this is not doing anything. Go to tuner preset, it's not intuitive at all. And if you press preset channel here, it's going between sound modes, because there are different basically sub-channel modes in the remote that make the menu system absolutely confusing. And I've been playing with these sorts of amps on and off for 20 years, and basically I find all of these amplifiers super confusing because they don't have dedicated buttons. You've all got menus and sub-menus, and because there is no on-screen display with a television or a monitor, you don't actually really know what you're doing. You're relying on this display on the front there. But because it's too complicated to use with the remote and not easy enough to use, I won't be hanging on to this one. Anyway, so that's the Yamaha HTR-6230. I think the 6250 does have audio pass-through on HDMI. So if you see one of these, I think less than $50, I'd pick one up, but any more than that, I wouldn't bother.